In the dying months of World War II, Germany unveiled a weapon the world had never seen: a jet so fast, so advanced, it seemed untouchable. The Messerschmitt ME-262. Hitler's miracle machine could outfly every Allied plane in the sky. German pilots believed it would change everything, that this storm bird would sweep the Allies from Europe's airspace and turn defeat into victory. But war doesn't reward arrogance. In the skies over Europe, American Mustang aces were waiting. These pilots had learned through blood and loss how to hunt. And when the ME-262 roared into battle, the hunters became the hunted. What followed was a clash of Eros piston versus jet, courage versus overconfidence. The air burned with gunfire. Pilots who believed they were invincible fell in flames. This is the story of how the world's first jet fighters, once Germany's greatest hope, became symbols of its final collapse. A story of innovation, desperation, and the men who learned that speed alone could not save them. This was the day Germany's jet dream died, in the twilight of the Second World War. As Allied bombers darkened the skies above a burning Reich, German engineers were building a miracle in the shadows, a machine that seemed decades ahead of its time. It was sleek, silver, and unlike anything the world had ever seen before. The Messerschmitt ME-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, promised to change the course of air warfare forever. Germany's Luftwaffe had once dominated the skies. In 1939 and 1940, its pilots carved a reputation for invincibility. But by 1944, the situation had reversed entirely. Allied air forces ruled from the Channel to the Oder River. Day after day, B-17s and Lancaster pounded German cities into dust, while P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires tore apart anything that dared to climb into the sky. Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and outmaneuvered. The Reich's air defense was collapsing. In desperation, Hitler demanded a wonder weapon, something that could restore air superiority and perhaps, just perhaps, reverse the tide of war. The answer came from the brilliant but overburdened engineers at Messerschmitt. Since the late 1930s, they had been experimenting with turbine engines, a concept so revolutionary that even their test pilots doubted it could work. The early prototypes barely held together. Engines exploded. Airframes caught fire. Pilots risked their lives every time they took off. But behind the smoke and shattered metal was a breakthrough. The jet engine promised speeds no propeller-driven aircraft could ever match. The ME-262 was designed around that idea: pure speed. Powered by twin Jumo 04 turbojets, it could reach nearly 900 kilometers per hour, over 100 faster than the best Allied fighters. In level flight, it was untouchable. German test pilots described the sensation as flying into the future. When the ME-262 streaked across the sky, it left piston aircraft looking like relics of a past age. The Luftwaffe finally had its miracle, or so it seemed. When word reached Hitler, his excitement was immediate but dangerous. The Führer believed this jet could be turned into a blitz bomber, a weapon capable of striking London and retreating before Allied defences could react. His obsession with offensive warfare distorted the programme's purpose. The ME-262 was delayed for months as engineers were ordered to modify it for bombing runs instead of fighter missions. The result was chaos. Jet engines were still fragile, maintenance teams untrained, and production lines constantly bombed by Allied raids. Despite these problems, The first operational squadron of ME-262 for WWII 7 was formed in early 1945. Their pilots, many of them veterans of the Battle of Britain, believed they were about to reclaim the skies. As the jets rolled out of camouflaged hangars and thundered down airstrips, ground crews stared in awe. The noise was unlike anything they'd heard before, a piercing scream that shook the ground. Villagers looked up to see silver, lightning bolts slicing through the sky. The Reich's newspapers hailed the jet as a turning point, calling it Hitler's secret weapon of the air. But even as the ME-262 entered combat, reality was already catching up. The Luftwaffe no longer had the fuel or the trained pilots to sustain this new fleet. The jet's engines lasted barely 25 flight hours before needing replacement. Each unit required scarce metals Germany could no longer easily produce. And above all, Allied bombers were systematically destroying the very factories that built them. The miracle weapon was being born in a dying nation. Still, for a brief moment, the ME-262 achieved what no German aircraft had done in years. It terrified the Allies. Mustang pilots reported seeing blur, like objects flash past them, before realizing they'd just encountered a jet. Bombers fell to the ME-262, cannons in bursts of flame. It was a glimpse of the future, a weapon from another era, unleashed too soon. The jet revolution had begun, but it came too late to save the Reich that created it. The ME-262 would not change the outcome of the war, but it would forever change the history of aviation. Every fighter that came after, from the Sabre to the MiG, carried traces of the lessons learned from this desperate German experiment. The ME-262 was both a marvel and a tragedy. A machine of unmatched innovation, born in chaos, commanded by arrogance, and doomed by time. For the pilots who first took it to the skies, it felt like victory reborn, until they looked down and realized that the world below was already lost. By 1944, the German Reich was collapsing on every front. Its armies were retreating across Europe, cities lay in ruins, and the sky itself belonged to the Allies. The once feared Luftwaffe had been reduced to fragments of its former strength. Each day, hundreds of American bombers crossed German airspace, escorted by sleek P-51 Mustangs that hunted anything that tried to rise against them. For the first time, Germany could no longer defend its own homeland. In this chaos, the ME-262 became a symbol of desperate hope. It was more than just a new aircraft, it was seen as salvation. The jet's unprecedented speed promised to outfly the enemy, to strike back against the bombers that leveled German factories and homes. Newspapers spoke of a coming miracle, whispering that the new jet fighters would drive the Allies from the skies and bring the war back under control. But hope in war is often fragile, and in Germany's case, it was built on illusion. Production was rushed at a frantic pace. Factories operated under constant bombing raids. Components were scattered across underground tunnels and forests to escape Allied reconnaissance. The engineers who once took months to test a single prototype were now ordered to deliver dozens every week. Engines that should have undergone careful inspection were pushed straight into service. Even paint was sometimes skipped to save time and materials. Every ME-262 that left the assembly line was a technical masterpiece born out of chaos. The pilots who climbed into these jets were veterans of an air force that no longer existed. Many had watched their comrades die in outnumbered dogfights against Allied formations. Now, they were handed a machine unlike anything they had ever flown, with almost no time to train. The jet's controls were sensitive, its engines fragile, and its takeoff speed dangerously high. A single mistake could cause the turbines to overheat and explode. Yet these men took off anyway, believing that this machine might finally give them a chance to fight back. When the ME-262 entered combat, its speed astonished everyone. Allied pilots described it as a silver phantom, appearing out of nowhere, attacking with devastating fire and vanishing before they could react. The jet could close in on bomber formations, unleash its 30-millimeter cannons, and climb away untouched. For a few short weeks, it seemed as if the Luftwaffe had rediscovered its power. But the truth was different. The jet's speed was both its strength and its curse. The ME-262 could outrun anything in the sky, yet Germany lacked the organization, fuel, and pilots to use it effectively. Each mission drained the last reserves of jet fuel. Replacement engines were scarce, and even the best pilots struggled to manage the aircraft's delicate systems. Allied forces quickly adapted, waiting for the jets near their bases, striking them during takeoff or landing when their speed advantage disappeared. For all its brilliance, the ME-262 became a symbol not of victory, but of desperation. It represented the final gamble of a nation that had run out of time. Germany's dream of reclaiming the skies rested on a weapon too advanced for its collapsing infrastructure. The jet roared into the heavens at 900 kilometers per hour. But every flight carried the same truth. Speed alone could no longer save the Reich. When the Messerschmitt ME-262 first appeared in European skies, Allied pilots could hardly believe their eyes. It was unlike anything they had ever faced. The jet streaked across the clouds faster than any propeller aircraft could follow, striking with explosive power before vanishing into the distance. For a moment, it seemed that Germany had found a weapon capable of changing the course of the air war. The Allied bomber crews began to whisper about a new ghost plane, one that appeared too quickly to stop. But fear alone never won wars. Within weeks, Allied intelligence had gathered enough reports and wreckage to understand the threat. They learned that while the ME-262 was revolutionary, it had weaknesses, and those weaknesses could be exploited. The jet's engines were delicate and took long minutes to warm up. Its landing gear was fragile, and its acceleration sluggish at low speeds. The Allies realized that to defeat the ME-262, they would not fight it in the air, but on the ground and during takeoff or landing. Soon, new tactics were born. Squadrons of P-51 Mustangs were assigned a new mission: hunt the jets. They began circling near German airfields, known to house ME-262 squadrons, waiting like predators near a watering hole. The Mustang pilots knew that if they caught the jet at the right moment, when its engines were still spooling up, or when it was coming in to land, they had a chance. It was a dangerous game, but the Allied pilots were fearless, and their discipline unmatched. Reports from the front became more frequent. A jet spotted on final approach, its pilot concentrating on landing, suddenly torn apart by a diving Mustang. A ME-262 lifting off under the roar of its unsteady turbines, struck before it could reach combat speed. Each encounter was a race against time and altitude. The skies over Germany turned into a deadly theatre of ambushes, where seconds decided life or death. Allied commanders encouraged the new tactics with cold precision. Intelligence teams tracked every known jet base: Augsburg, Lechfeld, Achmar, and others. Reconnaissance flights mapped the runways and photographed hangars. Mustang groups were briefed in detail before each mission. Strike them where they're slow, one report read. Do not chase them. Make them come to you. By the spring of 1945, the once proud jet squadrons were fighting under siege conditions. They had the most advanced aircraft in the world, yet nowhere to fly them safely. Every sortie risked destruction before it began. The airfields became battlefields themselves, lined with smoking wrecks and craters from Allied strafing runs. Despite the danger, German pilots continued to fly. They believed in their machines and their comrades. But for every ME-262 that took to the sky, several never returned. The Allied trap was working. What had started as a terror weapon was now being hunted relentlessly by men who refused to yield the air. In the end, the Allies had done what few thought possible. They had learned to outthink the jet. Through patience, observation, and courage, the Mustang aces turned Germany's technological marvel into an easy target. The ME-262 had been born from the dream of speed and dominance, but it was undone by human adaptability, by pilots who understood that every machine, no matter how advanced, has its moment of weakness. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the most advanced aircraft of its time, a machine that looked as though it had fallen from the future into the dying days of the Reich. It was fast, sleek, and deadly. But for all its brilliance, it carried within it the seeds of its own failure. The flaw was not in its wings or guns, but in the moment of history that birthed it. Germany had created the jet age too early, without the time, fuel, or stability to make it truly work. At its core, the ME-262 was a technological marvel crippled by the realities of war. Its engines, the Junkers Jumo 04, could propel the aircraft to incredible speeds, yet they were fragile and short-lived. Built from poor, quality alloys, because Germany had run out of key metals. The turbines burned out after just 25 hours of flight. Pilots learned to treat the throttle like a weapon that could kill them. If they accelerated too quickly, the engines could flame out. If they pushed too hard, they might melt the blades midair. The jet was powerful, but it was unstable, and that instability would haunt every pilot who dared to fly it. The production crisis made things worse. Allied bombers targeted every facility connected to jet construction. Factories were forced underground, workers toiled in darkness, and parts arrived incomplete or damaged. Engines were assembled in tunnels and forests by a labor force that was exhausted and terrified. There were stories of entire batches of engines that failed before their first flight. Even the best engineers could not overcome the shortages that crippled Germany in the final year of the war. Then came one of the most fateful decisions of the conflict. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with offensive weapons, ordered the ME-262 to be converted into a fighter bomber. He demanded that it carry bombs and attack Allied ground forces, calling it the Blitzbomber. His generals pleaded to keep it as a pure interceptor, the role it was designed for, but Hitler refused. This decision delayed its operational use by nearly a year. Time Germany no longer had. By the time the ME-262 finally entered combat in large numbers, the Allies had already gained air superiority, so complete that even the jet's speed could not tip the balance. Every sortie became a gamble. Pilots faced fuel shortages so severe that many flights were cut short before combat even began. The Luftwaffe's infrastructure was collapsing. Airfields were bombed daily, fuel depots destroyed, and the mechanics who once serviced the aircraft were gone. A single jet engine required hours of careful maintenance, but most had to fly again immediately after landing. Each mission drained the last remnants of Germany's aviation industry. And yet, despite everything, the ME-262 did fly. It shot down hundreds of bombers and terrified Allied crews. But these victories were isolated sparks in a sky already lost. For every bomber destroyed, 2 jets were lost on the ground or caught during takeoff. The promise of the jet had arrived too late, like a miracle whispered to a dying empire. The ME-262 could have changed the world had it come sooner, had Germany the time to perfect it. Instead, it became a tragic monument to ambition outpacing reality. A weapon too advanced for its age, born in a nation that no longer had the strength to wield it. By early 1945, the skies over Germany were no longer safe for anyone wearing the Iron Cross. The Luftwaffe had grown desperate, its fuel nearly gone, its airfields bombed daily, and its pilots worn to exhaustion. Yet, against this backdrop of ruin, the ME-262 jets still soared, faster than any Allied plane, cutting through bomber formations like silver blades. For a brief moment, they seemed unstoppable. But the Allies had men who refused to accept defeat. The American Mustang aces would become the hunters who turned the tide against the jet menace. The P-51 Mustang had already become legendary. With its long range, deadly precision, and unmatched agility, it had escorted Allied bombers deep into German territory. But the introduction of the ME-262 presented a new challenge, a target that could outfly and outclimb them with ease. At first, the Allied pilots were stunned. Their bullets couldn't even reach the retreating jets before they disappeared into the clouds. Yet, these were men trained not just to fight, but to adapt. Intelligence officers quickly shared reports across squadrons. The jets, they discovered, were slow and clumsy on takeoff and landing. They needed long, straight runways, and their engines took precious minutes to spool up before flight. That was all the Mustang aces needed. They changed their strategy completely. Instead of chasing the jets in the open sky, they would wait for them like hunters at the edge of a den. Every morning, before dawn, P-51s patrolled near known jet bases Lechfeld, Munich, and Achmar. They flew high, scanning the airfields below. Then, as soon as a ME-262 was spotted taxiing or climbing, they dove in at terrifying speeds. The Mustangs attacked in pairs or trios, strafing the runway, catching the jets before they could reach combat speed. Many German pilots never even made it off the ground. Eyewitnesses described the scenes with chilling detail. The ME-262s roared forward, engines screaming, when suddenly the air would explode with gunfire. Dust and flames erupted around them. A jet would veer off the runway, engines burning, its pilot ejecting too late. Those who managed to get airborne found the Mustangs waiting on their return, circling above the airfields like hawks. As soon as a jet slowed to land, the trap was sprung. One famous engagement involved American ace Chuck Yeager. Spotting a ME-262 preparing to land, he dived from high altitude, cutting across its flight path. The German pilot tried to turn, but the jet's engines could not respond quickly enough. Yeager's bullets tore through its fuselage, sending it crashing into the fields below. Stories like this became increasingly common, and morale among the German jet squadrons began to crumble. What had begun as Germany's greatest hope had turned into a symbol of helplessness. The more they flew, the more they lost, not in open dogfights, but in ambushes they could not avoid. The Mustang aces had mastered not just the art of flying, but the psychology of war. They knew their enemy's weakness and struck precisely when pride turned to vulnerability. By April 1945, the outcome was clear. The ME-262 squadrons were being wiped out faster than they could be replaced. The once feared jets had become easy prey, and the Mustangs ruled the sky. The Americans had turned Germany's own miracle weapon into its downfall, proving once again that courage, discipline, and intelligence can defeat even the most advanced technology. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer a mighty air force. It was a scattered remnant of what had once ruled the skies over Europe. The roar of engines that once filled the air had been replaced by silence, broken only by the occasional scream of an ME-262 taking flight from a half-destroyed runway. Germany was collapsing on all fronts. Allied tanks pushed through its cities. Soviet artillery thundered from the east, and in the air, the Allies owned the heavens completely. Yet still, the German pilots flew. They flew not for victory, for they knew victory was no longer possible, but for duty, for pride, and for each other. Each mission carried the weight of futility, and yet the men who strapped themselves into their ME-262s did so with grim determination. Many were barely in their 20s, veterans of countless battles, haunted by the memories of friends who had never returned. For them, the jet represented not just a weapon, but the last flicker of what the Luftwaffe had once been. The airfields they launched from were scenes of ruin. Craters pocked the runways, hangars lay in ashes, and mechanics worked under the constant threat of air raids. Fuel was so scarce that only a handful of aircraft could take off each day. Pilots often shared rations and flight gear, knowing each sortie might be their last. Some jets were towed to hidden clearings in the forest, taking off from dirt strips barely long enough to lift them into the air. Still, they went. When they encountered the enemy, the battles were brief and brutal. The ME-262 could still outrun almost anything in the sky, but the numbers were hopelessly against them. Allied Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Tempests patrolled constantly, ready to pounce. Every takeoff became a deadly gamble. If the jet engines didn't fail, if fuel held long enough, if they could strike a bomber formation and escape before interception, then maybe, for a few fleeting minutes, they could remind the world that the Luftwaffe still fought. There are accounts of pilots who returned to find their bases gone, bombed to rubble in their absence. Others landed in fields, their aircraft riddled with bullets, and walked for miles to reach friendly lines that no longer existed. Some were captured beside their burning jets, others simply vanished into the smoke and chaos of a dying nation. One story tells of a young pilot who, after his final mission, stood beside his wrecked ME-262 and refused to abandon it. He reportedly said, "She was faster than the wind, faster than our time." His words echoed the truth of the entire war. For Germany's jet program, they had built something extraordinary, but too late to change their fate. As April turned to May, the last ME-262 flights took to the air. They rose from shattered runways, flew into skies crowded with enemies, and vanished into history. No reinforcements came. No victory awaited. Only courage remained. The courage to face the inevitable and still fight. When Germany finally surrendered, the surviving jets were captured and studied by the Allies, marking the dawn of a new era in aviation. But for the men who flew them, the ME-262 would forever symbolize something deeper, a final act of defiance against the unstoppable tide of defeat, and a testament to the human will to keep flying, even when the world was falling apart. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the ruins of Europe told the story of unimaginable destruction. Cities lay in ashes, armies were broken, and the Reich that once promised domination had vanished from the map. But amid the wreckage, the Allies discovered something extraordinary, a glimpse of the future. Scattered across captured airfields were the remains of the Messerschmitt ME-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It had not saved Germany, but it had changed the course of aviation forever. Engineers and pilots from every Allied nation swarmed over the wrecks. The British, Americans, and Soviets all raced to recover intact jets. They studied the engines, the swept wings, the aerodynamics, and the strange materials that made the ME-262 faster than anything else in the sky. What they learned would shape the next generation of aircraft. Within just a few years, jet-powered fighters and bombers filled the skies of the post-war world, each one carrying a trace of the German design that had once terrified Allied crews. The irony was sharp. The same technology that might have prolonged the war became the foundation of peace through progress. The ME-262 had shown what was possible, but its creators had built it under the wrong flag, at the wrong time, and for the wrong cause. Yet history often transforms tragedy into transformation. The jet age that began in defeat would soon become humanity's leap into the future, into supersonic flight, into space, into the modern era of air power. For the men who had fought against the ME-262, memories of its appearance remained vivid. Many Allied pilots described the first time they saw the jet as witnessing a weapon from another century. It had inspired both awe and fear, and even in victory, they respected the courage of the German pilots who flew them. To face overwhelming odds with such fragile machines took immense bravery. Those young men, though fighting for a lost cause, had ushered in a new kind of warfare that no one could ignore. The Allies wasted no time applying what they had learned. America's Bell P-80 Shooting Star, Britain's Gloucester Meteor, and later the Soviet MiG series all drew from the same technological lineage. Within a decade, the world had gone from piston engines to jet squadrons breaking the sound barrier. The ME-262 had been the spark, and once lit, that spark could not be contained. In the years that followed, the jet became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of modernity, of speed, and of human ambition. But the story of the ME-262 remained a haunting reminder of how innovation and destruction often walk hand in hand. It was proof that even the most advanced creation cannot change the outcome of a war fought on crumbling ideals. The legacy of the ME-262 lives on in every jet that has since touched the sky. Its engines were crude by modern standards, its missions tragic and short-lived, yet its impact was eternal. Born in the dying embers of a defeated nation, it became the blueprint for the future of flight. A paradox of history, where genius emerged from ruin, and from the ashes of war, humanity learned to fly faster than ever before,